1863, the height of the American Civil War. A nation tears itself apart over the question of slavery, over whether human beings can be owned as property. We think we know this story. Enslaved black people fighting for freedom, white plantation owners fighting to maintain their power. But what if I told you there was a family that challenged everything we thought we knew about slavery in America? A family that was white, yet enslaved. A family that was considered property, yet would rise to become one of the most respected and influential families in American history. Their name was Parker, and their story is so extraordinary, so paradoxical, that it was nearly erased from the history books. This is the untold story of how a family of white slaves became American icons, and what their journey reveals about the true nature of power, race, and freedom in America. Before we begin, we need to understand what white slavery meant in 1863, because this term has been misunderstood and misused throughout history. White slavery, or indentured servitude in its most extreme forms, existed in America since colonial times. Poor Europeans, often Irish, Scottish, or English, would sign contracts binding themselves to wealthy landowners for a period of years, typically 7, in exchange for passage to America and the promise of land or money at the end of their term. In theory, this was a voluntary contract, a path to eventual freedom and prosperity. In practice, for many, it became a form of bondage nearly indistinguishable from chattel slavery. Indentured servants could be bought and sold, beaten, separated from their families, and denied basic rights. If they tried to escape, their terms could be extended. If they became pregnant, additional years would be added to their service. And for some families, like the Parkers, the system became hereditary, passed down from generation to generation through legal manipulation and debt bondage that made escape impossible. The Parker family's story begins in Ireland in the 1790s. Thomas Parker was a farmer in County Cork, struggling to feed his family during a time of famine and economic hardship. When a labor agent came through offering passage to America and the promise of work, Thomas saw an opportunity. He signed a contract binding himself and his family to 7 years of service to a wealthy landowner in Virginia. The contract seemed reasonable at the time. 7 years of hard work in exchange for freedom, land, and a new life. Thomas, his wife Margaret, and their 3 young children boarded a ship in 1796, leaving behind everything they knew for the promise of a better future. But when they arrived in Virginia, they quickly discovered that the contract they had signed was very different from what had been promised. The landowner, a man named William Ashford, treated them not as temporary workers, but as permanent property. The Parker family was put to work on Ashford's tobacco plantation alongside enslaved black people. They lived in similar conditions, worked the same brutal hours, and faced the same punishments for resistance or failure to meet quotas. But there was a crucial difference in how they were perceived. The enslaved black people on the plantation were considered inherently inferior, deemed naturally suited for bondage by the racist ideology of the time. The Parkers, being white, created a cognitive dissonance for those who encountered them. How could white people, supposedly the superior race, be in bondage? The answer, in the minds of many, was that the Parkers must have done something to deserve their status. They must be criminals, debtors, morally deficient. This perception made their situation in some ways even more isolating than that of the enslaved black people, who at least had a community of shared experience and mutual support. Thomas Parker worked himself nearly to death trying to fulfill the terms of his contract, believing that if he could just survive the 7 years, his family would be free. But Ashford had other plans. As the 7-year mark approached, Ashford claimed that Thomas owed him money for food, shelter, and clothing provided during the term of service. These debts, Ashford insisted, had to be paid before the family could be released. The amounts were astronomical, clearly inflated or fabricated. Thomas protested, but he had no legal recourse. Indentured servants had almost no rights, and local courts invariably sided with wealthy landowners. Thomas's contract was extended another 7 years, then another. Thomas Parker died in 1812, still in bondage, never having achieved the freedom he had been promised. On his deathbed, he made his eldest son, also named Thomas, promise to find a way to free the family. If you're already captivated by this extraordinary story, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and share this video with anyone who needs to understand that the history of slavery in America is far more complex than we've been taught. Your support helps us bring these forgotten stories to light. Now, let's continue with how young Thomas Parker began his fight for freedom. Young Thomas Parker, born in America in 1798, grew up in bondage, but with a fire in his belly. Unlike his father, who had tried to work within the system, Thomas saw the system itself as the problem. He watched as the Ashford family profited from the labor of both white indentured servants and enslaved black people, and he recognized that the two forms of bondage, while legally different, were morally equivalent. Thomas began to educate himself, secretly learning to read and write with the help of an enslaved woman named Sarah, who worked in the main house and had been taught by a previous, more liberal owner. Sarah and Thomas formed a deep bond, united by their shared experience of bondage and their shared dream of freedom. They would meet late at night, after the day's work was done, and Sarah would teach Thomas not just literacy, but also philosophy, history, and the art of negotiation. By 1820, Thomas had become an indispensable member of the plantation workforce. He was skilled in carpentry, metalwork, and management of other workers. William Ashford, the original owner, had died, and his son Robert now ran the plantation. Robert Ashford was less interested in the day-to-day operations and more interested in profit. Thomas saw an opportunity. He proposed to Robert that instead of simply working off the family's supposed debt, he be allowed to take on additional paid work for other landowners in the area, with a portion of those earnings going to Ashford and a portion going toward buying the Parker family's freedom. Robert, seeing a way to profit without additional effort, agreed. For the next decade, Thomas worked double time. He would fulfill his obligations to the Ashford plantation during the day and then work for other clients in the evenings and on Sundays. He saved every penny, living as frugally as possible. His wife, Mary, whom he had married within the bonded community, supported him by taking in washing and sewing. Slowly, painfully, they accumulated money. But Robert Ashford kept moving the goalposts, increasing the debt whenever Thomas got close to paying it off. By 1830, Thomas was 32 years old and exhausted. He had been working himself to the bone for a decade with little progress toward freedom. But then something happened that would change everything: the rise of the abolitionist movement. While abolitionists primarily focused on chattel slavery and the plight of black Americans, some also opposed indentured servitude and debt bondage. A Quaker abolitionist named Ezekiel Harrison came to the region and heard about the Parker family's situation. Ezekiel was appalled that white families were being held in hereditary bondage and saw this as a useful way to appeal to white Northerners who might not care about black enslaved people but would be outraged by white people in similar conditions. Ezekiel offered to help Thomas by publicizing the Parker family's story and providing legal assistance. Thomas was initially skeptical. He had heard promises before, but Ezekiel was genuine and he had connections. The case of the Parker family became a cause célèbre in abolitionist circles in the early 1830s. Newspapers in the North ran stories about the family of white people held in bondage in Virginia, framing it as a moral outrage. The publicity put pressure on Robert Ashford, who was embarrassed by the attention. His reputation in polite society was being damaged by accusations that he was no better than a slaveholder. In 1833, after intense negotiation mediated by Ezekiel Harrison and with financial support from abolitionist donors, Thomas Parker was finally able to purchase his family's freedom. The cost was exorbitant, but it was paid. After 37 years, the Parker family was finally free. Thomas was 35 years old. His mother, Margaret, who had made the original journey from Ireland, had died years earlier, still in bondage. His siblings had scattered, some still trapped in various forms of servitude. But Thomas, his wife Mary, and their 3 children were free at last. Freedom, however, did not mean acceptance or prosperity. The Parker family settled in Philadelphia, a city with a large, free black population and a strong abolitionist community. Thomas found work as a carpenter, using the skills he had developed during his years of bondage. But the family faced prejudice from multiple directions. Some white people looked down on them, assuming they had been in bondage because of moral failing or criminality. Some free black people resented them, seeing their story being used by abolitionists to generate sympathy for white suffering, while black enslaved people continued to suffer in far greater numbers and with far less public outrage. The Parkers existed in a strange, liminal space, not fully accepted by either community. But Thomas refused to be bitter. He had survived too much to waste his freedom on anger. Instead, he dedicated himself to building a better life for his family and to fighting against all forms of bondage, not just the one he had experienced. Thomas began speaking at abolitionist meetings, sharing his family's story. His speeches were powerful because they came from lived experience. He could describe the brutality of bondage, the dehumanization, the way the system crushed hope. But he was also careful to always connect his experience to the larger issue of chattel slavery. He would say, "What was done to my family was evil, but what is being done to millions of black Americans is evil on a scale almost too large to comprehend. We must end all forms of human bondage, not just the ones that affect people who look like me." This approach earned him respect in abolitionist circles and began to heal some of the tensions between the Parkers and the black community. Thomas also worked closely with the Underground Railroad, using his carpentry skills to build hidden compartments in homes and wagons, and using his experience as someone who had been hunted for attempting to escape to advise fugitives on how to avoid capture. By 1840, Thomas Parker had become a respected member of Philadelphia's reform community. His children were receiving education, something he had been denied. His eldest son, James, showed particular promise as a scholar and speaker. Thomas's wife, Mary, opened a small shop selling baked goods and preserves, providing additional income for the family. They were not wealthy, but they were stable, respected, and most importantly, free. Thomas also reconnected with Sarah, the enslaved woman who had taught him to read decades earlier. Sarah had eventually been able to purchase her own freedom with money earned from side work, and she had also settled in Philadelphia. The two remained close friends for the rest of their lives, their bond forged in the shared experience of bondage and the shared commitment to abolition. Sarah often accompanied Thomas to speaking engagements, and together they presented a powerful testimony about the ways that slavery and bondage crossed racial lines, while still acknowledging the unique horrors of chattel slavery. As the 1840s progressed and tensions over slavery intensified, the Parker family found themselves increasingly involved in political activism. Thomas's son James became a prominent writer and speaker, publishing essays and giving lectures about the need to end all forms of human exploitation. James was particularly effective at reaching audiences who might be resistant to abolitionism by starting with his family's story and then expanding to the broader issue. He would say, "If you are outraged by what happened to my family, and you should be, then you must be equally outraged by what is happening to millions of black Americans." The principle is the same. No human being should be property. If you believe that for us, you must believe it for everyone. James's rhetoric was persuasive, and he became a sought-after speaker in the growing abolitionist movement. He also became involved in the women's rights movement, recognizing that multiple forms of oppression were interconnected and required a comprehensive response. We're now deep into the Parker family's transformation from bondage to influence, and if their journey is resonating with you, please take a moment to subscribe, leave a like, and share this video. Stories like this challenge our understanding of history and remind us that freedom has always required struggle from many different communities. Your support keeps these stories alive. Now, let's see how the Parkers navigated the turbulent years leading to the Civil War. By 1850, the political situation in America was reaching a breaking point. The Compromise of 1850, which included the Fugitive Slave Act, outraged abolitionists and made the work of the Underground Railroad more dangerous. The Parker family, particularly James, became even more active in resistance. James harbored fugitives in his home, raised money for their transport to Canada, and worked with other activists to resist the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act. This work was risky. People who aided fugitives could be fined, imprisoned, or even killed by angry slave catchers. But James felt he had no choice. His family's experience had taught him that bondage in any form was intolerable, and he could not stand by while others suffered. Thomas, now in his 50s, supported his son's activism while also working to expand the family's economic base. He had saved enough money to purchase a small building in Philadelphia, which he converted into a workshop where he employed other free black workers and former indentured servants, teaching them skilled trades. The Parker family workshop became a kind of community center, a place where people who had experienced bondage could find work, learn skills, and rebuild their lives. Thomas insisted on paying fair wages and treating workers with dignity, creating a model of ethical business that contrasted sharply with the exploitative norms of the time. The workshop was profitable, and the Parker family's financial situation improved significantly. By 1855, they were solidly middle class, a remarkable achievement given their origins. But Thomas and James never forgot where they came from, and they used their resources to support others. They donated to schools for free black children, supported abolition newspapers, and helped fund legal defenses for fugitives who were captured. The family's motto, which Thomas had instilled in his children, was, "Freedom is not truly ours until it belongs to everyone." When the Civil War broke out in 1861, the Parker family saw it as both a tragedy and an opportunity. James, along with his younger brothers, wanted to enlist in the Union Army immediately. Thomas was torn. He had already lost so much of his life to bondage and struggle, and the thought of losing his sons to war was almost unbearable. But he also understood that this was a pivotal moment, a chance to end slavery once and for all. When the Union finally began accepting black soldiers in 1863, and when it became clear that white men who had experienced bondage were also welcome to serve, James and his brothers enlisted. Thomas, too old to fight, threw himself into supporting the war effort, using his workshop to produce supplies for the army and organizing fundraising efforts in Philadelphia. Mary Parker and the family's daughters worked with aid societies, providing medical supplies and support for soldiers and their families. The war years were difficult for the Parker family. James was wounded at the Battle of Gettysburg, but survived. One of his brothers, Robert, was killed at the Battle of Antietam. The loss devastated the family, but it also strengthened their resolve. Robert had died fighting to end slavery, to ensure that no other families would experience what the Parkers had experienced. His sacrifice had to mean something. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, the Parker family celebrated, But they also knew the work was far from over. Legal emancipation was just the beginning. The real challenge would be ensuring that formerly enslaved people had the resources, education, and opportunities to build free lives. Thomas and James began planning for what would come after the war, thinking about how they could use their experience and resources to support reconstruction and the integration of millions of formerly enslaved people into American society. After the war ended in 1865, the Parker family threw themselves into reconstruction efforts. James traveled to the South, working with the Freedmen's Bureau to establish schools and provide legal assistance to formerly enslaved people. He also worked to document the experiences of those who had been enslaved, believing that their stories needed to be preserved and told. Thomas expanded his workshop, hiring formerly enslaved people and teaching them trades. He also began writing his memoirs, wanting to ensure that his family's story would not be forgotten. Thomas's memoir, published in 1868 and titled From Bondage to Freedom, the Story of the Parker Family, was a modest success. It was read primarily in abolitionist and reform circles, but it contributed to the growing body of literature documenting the evils of slavery and indentured servitude. Thomas died in 1870 at the age of 72, having lived to see slavery abolished and his family established as respected members of society. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, both black and white, a testament to the bridges he had built and the respect he had earned. After Thomas's death, James Parker became the head of the family and continued his father's legacy of activism and business. James expanded the family enterprise, opening multiple workshops across Pennsylvania and eventually into other northern states. He employed hundreds of workers, always insisting on fair wages and good working conditions. The Parker workshops became known for quality craftsmanship and ethical practices, and they were profitable enough to make the family quite wealthy by the 1880s. But James never forgot his family's origins. He continued to speak publicly about the experience of bondage, even as some people advised him to distance himself from that past, now that the family had achieved respectability. James refused. He believed that hiding the past would be a betrayal of everyone who was still suffering, everyone who was still fighting for justice. He continued to support civil rights organizations, women's suffrage groups, and labor movements, seeing all of these struggles as interconnected. James also became involved in politics, serving on the Philadelphia City Council in the 1870s and eventually being elected to the Pennsylvania State Legislature in 1880. He was one of the few legislators who had personally experienced bondage, and he used that perspective to push for progressive legislation, better labor protections, funding for public education, civil rights protections for Black Americans. He faced opposition from conservative legislators who saw him as too radical, but he also built coalitions with other reformers and was able to achieve some significant victories. James's political career was not without controversy. Some conservative newspapers attacked him, dredging up his family's history of bondage and trying to use it to discredit him. But these attacks often backfired, as James would respond with powerful speeches about how his experience made him more, not less, qualified to understand the needs of working people and marginalized communities. By 1890, the Parker family had become one of the most prominent reform families in Pennsylvania. James's children, the third generation of Parkers born in America, were well-educated and successful. His eldest daughter, Elizabeth, became a teacher and opened a school for working-class children, both black and white. His son, Thomas, named after his grandfather, became a lawyer and focused on civil rights cases, defending Black Americans who faced discrimination and violence. The family's businesses continued to thrive, and they used their wealth to fund charitable causes and political campaigns. The Parkers had achieved a level of success and respectability that would have been unimaginable to Thomas Parker Sr. when he arrived in America in 1796, but the family never forgot where they came from, and they remained committed to fighting for those who were still struggling. The Parker family story also had a profound impact on American society's understanding of bondage and freedom. Their experience challenged simplistic narratives about slavery being solely a racial institution. While chattel slavery was overwhelmingly directed at black Americans and was justified by racist ideology, the Parker family's story showed that economic exploitation and bondage could cross racial lines. This was an uncomfortable truth for many Americans, both in the 19th century and today. It complicated the narrative in ways that made some people uneasy. Some abolitionists had used the Parker story to argue that white people could be enslaved too, therefore all Americans should oppose slavery. But others, including the Parkers themselves, made a more nuanced argument. The fact that bondage could happen to white people should not be necessary to motivate opposition to slavery. Slavery was wrong, regardless of the race of the enslaved person, and the fact that it primarily targeted black Americans made it even more urgent to oppose. The Parker family also faced criticism and resentment from some quarters. Some black activists and intellectuals felt that the attention given to the Parker family's story detracted from the experiences of the millions of black Americans who had been enslaved. They argued that white suffering was being centered in ways that black suffering never was, and that this reflected ongoing racial biases even within progressive movements. The Parkers were sensitive to these criticisms and tried to address them in their public work. James Parker, in particular, was careful to always contextualize his family's story within the larger history of slavery. He would acknowledge that his family, despite their bondage, had advantages that enslaved black people did not have. They were never legally defined as less than human. Their bondage was supposed to be temporary, even if it became hereditary, and once free, they faced less discrimination than free black people. James argued that these distinctions mattered and that the fight for racial justice required recognizing the unique horrors of chattel slavery. If you've made it this far with us through the Parker family's incredible journey, it's time for one more call to action. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, smash that like button, and please share this video with everyone you know. The Parker family's story is a crucial part of American history that has been largely forgotten, and sharing videos like this ensures that these stories reach new audiences and spark important conversations. Now let's bring the Parker story into the 20th century and beyond. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the Parker family continued to evolve and expand their influence. The younger generations benefited from the foundation laid by Thomas and James, receiving excellent educations and entering professions that had been closed to their grandparents. Parker grandchildren became doctors, lawyers, professors, and business owners. The family remained active in progressive causes, supporting the labor movement, women's suffrage, and the early civil rights movement. But they also faced new challenges. As the memory of slavery faded and as Reconstruction gave way to the Jim Crow era, many Americans wanted to forget the uncomfortable truths about bondage and exploitation. The Parker family's story, which had once been celebrated in abolitionist circles, became an embarrassment to some, a reminder of a past that people preferred not to examine too closely. In the early 20th century, some Parker family members began to downplay or hide their origins. This was particularly true for those who had moved to other parts of the country where the family history was not known. They would present themselves simply as a successful American family, leaving out the generations of bondage that had preceded their success. This caused tension within the family. Some members, particularly those who had been closest to Thomas and James, felt that hiding the past was a betrayal. They argued that the family story was important precisely because it was uncomfortable, because it challenged people to think differently about class, race, and power. Others countered that they had earned the right to define themselves on their own terms, not to be forever marked by a past they had not chosen. These debates played out in family gatherings and in private letters, and they reflected larger questions about identity, memory, and the right to self-definition. By the mid-20th century, most of the Parker family story had been forgotten by the broader public. Historians focusing on slavery primarily studied chattel slavery and the experience of Black Americans, which was absolutely appropriate given the scale and horror of that institution. The story of white indentured servitude and debt bondage, while important, was a smaller piece of the puzzle and received less attention. The Parker family's specific story, documented primarily in Thomas's memoir and in scattered newspaper articles from the abolitionist era, was known only to specialists. But in the 1960s and 70s, as the civil rights movement prompted a broader re-examination of American history, some historians began to revisit stories like the Parkers. They were interested in understanding the full complexity of labor exploitation in America, including forms of bondage that had affected poor whites as well as Black Americans. The Parker family memoir was republished, and scholars began to study the family's trajectory. This renewed interest brought the Parker story back into public consciousness, but it also sparked debates about how to interpret it. Some saw the Parker family as an inspirational story of overcoming adversity, a classic American tale of rising from nothing to achieve success. Others saw it as a cautionary tale about the ways that economic systems exploit the vulnerable regardless of race, and about how class and race intersect in complex ways. Still others worried that focusing on white bondage, even in a historical context, could be used to minimize the unique horror of chattel slavery and the ongoing impact of anti-Black racism. These were all legitimate perspectives, and the Parker family story was capacious enough to support multiple interpretations. The key, historians argued, was to study the Parkers without using their story to erase or diminish other stories, particularly those of Black Americans who suffered under chattel slavery. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, descendants of the Parker family began to reconnect with their heritage in new ways. Some conducted genealogical research, tracing the family tree back to Thomas and Margaret Parker's arrival from Ireland. Some traveled to Virginia to see the site of the Ashford plantation, where their ancestors had been held in bondage. The plantation itself was long gone, the land subdivided and developed, but standing on that ground was still a powerful experience. These descendants also worked to preserve the family's historical documents, including Thomas's memoir, James's speeches and letters, and family Bibles and photographs. Some of this material was donated to historical societies and archives, ensuring that future researchers would have access to the Parker family story. There were also efforts to tell the story in new ways, through documentaries, podcasts, and historical novels. Each retelling sparked new conversations about what the Parker family story means and how it fits into the larger narrative of American history. The Parker family's legacy is complex and multifaceted. On one level, their story is a testament to resilience and determination. Despite being born into bondage, despite facing obstacles that seemed insurmountable, the Parkers found a way to freedom and then used that freedom to help others. They built successful businesses, contributed to their communities, and fought for justice throughout their lives. They proved that it was possible to overcome even the most oppressive circumstances, though they were also clear that such overcoming required not just individual effort, but also systemic change and collective action. The Parkers benefited from the abolitionist movement, from legal reforms, from the support of allies who had resources and power. Their success was not simply a matter of pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. It was the result of hard work, combined with structural changes that made success possible. On another level, the Parker family story reveals the interconnected nature of different forms of oppression. While chattel slavery and indentured servitude were not identical, they shared common features: the treatment of human beings as property, the denial of autonomy and dignity, the extraction of labor through coercion rather than free choice. The Parkers understood these connections and made them central to their activism. They fought against all forms of bondage and exploitation, recognizing that true freedom required not just the absence of legal slavery, but also economic justice, political rights, and social respect. This intersectional understanding was ahead of its time and remains relevant today as we continue to grapple with the ways that different forms of inequality reinforce each other. The Parker family also demonstrated the importance of solidarity across racial lines. Despite facing prejudice from some quarters, and despite the temptation to focus solely on their own advancement, the Parkers consistently allied themselves with Black Americans fighting for freedom and equality. They understood that their liberation was tied to everyone's liberation, that no one could be truly free while others remained in bondage. The Parker family story also raises important questions about memory and historical narrative. For much of American history, the story of indentured servitude and debt bondage has been minimized or forgotten, while the story of chattel slavery, though absolutely central and deserving of extensive study, has sometimes been told in ways that obscure the economic motivations behind it. Both extremes are problematic. We need to understand the full complexity of American labor history, including the ways that different forms of exploitation coexisted and sometimes overlapped. We need to recognize that while chattel slavery was unique in its scale, its brutality, and its racial dimensions, it existed within a larger system of labor control that affected many different groups. And we need to tell these stories in ways that acknowledge both the commonalities and the crucial differences between various forms of bondage. The Parker family story helps us do this. It shows us white people in bondage, which challenges simplistic narratives about race and freedom. But it also shows us the limitations of that bondage, the ways that even in their unfree state, the Parkers had advantages that enslaved black people did not have, and the ways that once free, they were able to achieve acceptance and success that was far more difficult for Black Americans. Today, more than 2 centuries after Thomas and Margaret Parker arrived in America, their descendants are scattered across the country. Many are aware of their family history and take pride in it. They see their ancestors' struggles and achievements as a source of inspiration and as a reminder of the importance of fighting for justice. Some Parker descendants have become historians, activists, and community organizers, carrying on the family tradition of working for a more just society. Others have pursued different paths, but the family history remains a part of their identity. There have been efforts to establish a Parker Family Historical Society, to organize reunions, and to create educational materials about the family's story. These efforts have had mixed success, reflecting the challenges of maintaining family connections and historical memory across generations. But the interest remains strong, particularly among younger family members who are eager to understand where they came from and how their ancestors' experiences shape their own identities. The Parker family story also continues to be relevant to contemporary debates about labor, exploitation, and justice. In an era when human trafficking remains a global problem, when exploitative labor practices persist in many industries, and when economic inequality continues to grow, the Parkers' experience reminds us that bondage and exploitation take many forms. While we must never equate contemporary labor abuses with the horror of chattel slavery, we can learn from the past about how systems of exploitation operate, how they are justified, and how they can be resisted. The Parker family showed that resistance is possible, that even in the most oppressive circumstances, people can fight back and can build better lives. But they also showed that individual resistance is not enough, that structural change is necessary, and that solidarity across different communities is essential. These lessons remain vital as we continue to struggle for a world in which all people are truly free and all labor is truly dignified and fairly compensated. As we conclude this exploration of the Parker family's extraordinary journey from bondage to prominence, we are left with several enduring insights. First, the history of slavery and exploitation in America is more complex than simple narratives allow. While chattel slavery of black Americans was the defining labor system of the early republic and its legacy continues to shape our society, it coexisted with other forms of bondage that also deserve study and understanding. Second, freedom is not a simple state, but a complex condition that requires economic resources, political rights, social respect, and the ability to define one's own life. The Parkers achieved legal freedom in 1833, but they spent decades working to achieve fuller forms of freedom. Third, individual success, while important and worth celebrating, is not enough. The Parkers could have focused solely on their own advancement, but they chose instead to work for collective liberation. They understood that true freedom required systemic change, and that their own security depended on the freedom and justice of others. Fourth, historical memory matters. The fact that the Parker family story was nearly forgotten tells us something about whose stories get told and preserved. We must work actively to recover and tell the stories of those who have been marginalized or erased from official histories. And finally, the struggle for justice is ongoing. The Parker family fought against the forms of oppression they encountered in their time, but new forms continue to emerge. Each generation must take up the fight in its own context, drawing inspiration and wisdom from those who came before, while also innovating and adapting to new challenges. The Parker family would not want to be remembered simply as victims who overcame adversity. They would want to be remembered as fighters, as people who refused to accept injustice and who worked tirelessly to create a better world. They would want their story to inspire not just admiration, but action, not just reflection, but commitment to continuing the work they began. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Parker family's incredible story. If this journey through history has enlightened you, challenged you, or inspired you, please make sure you're subscribed to this channel, hit that like button, and share this video far and wide. The Parker family's legacy deserves to be known, and your engagement helps ensure that stories like theirs continue to reach new audiences and spark important conversations about freedom, justice, and what it truly means to overcome oppression. The Parker family showed us that the path from bondage to freedom is long and difficult, but it is possible. They showed us that success is sweetest when it is shared, and that true freedom requires not just personal achievement, but collective liberation. As we face our own struggles for justice in the 21st century, we can draw strength and wisdom from their example. The fight is not over, the work continues, and each of us has a role to play in building a world where no one is in bondage, where everyone is treated with dignity, and where freedom is not just a legal status, but a lived reality. The Parkers fought for that world. Now it is our turn to carry on their legacy.